Air Defense Colonel Zaki Hassan al-Rashid powered up his console at 2:47 a.m. on January 17, 1991, and saw exactly what he expected. Nothing. Every scope was clean. Every frequency was quiet. His Soviet-built spoon-rest radar was scanning, his SA-6 batteries were armed, and Baghdad's integrated air defense network was fully online, wired together the way Moscow's own engineers had taught them. How do you fly 1,271 combat missions over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth and never lose a single aircraft to enemy fire? How does a jet the size of a fighter vanish from every radar screen in a country bristling with over 16,000 surface-to-air missiles? What exactly did the Americans build that made an entire nation's defense network stare at empty skies while bombs were already falling? The answer was already airborne. Minutes before the first explosion of Operation Desert Storm, an F-117 Nighthawk pilot, his call sign unknown to Iraqi operators because not a single one of them ever saw him coming, was threading through the densest air defense corridor outside the Soviet Union itself. Below him, Baghdad was ringed with radar-guided SAMs, ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft guns, and overlapping early warning systems designed to guarantee that nothing entered Iraqi airspace undetected. Every system was active, every operator was alert, every screen was clear. The screens were not malfunctioning. The jet was simply not there. Not invisible. Nothing is truly invisible, but close enough to shatter the fundamental assumption that had governed air defense since the Second World War, that radar sees everything that flies. For 40 years, every military on Earth had built its doctrine around that assumption. Radar finds the target. Missiles kill the target. The chain was considered unbreakable. The F-117 didn't jam that chain or overwhelm it with countermeasures. It removed the first link entirely. If radar never acquires you, nothing else in the kill chain ever activates. The aircraft's radar return was not the size of a fighter, not the size of a bird. Engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works would later describe the design goal in terms civilians could actually grasp. Make a full-sized attack aircraft return a radar signature the size of a marble. A steel marble, rolling across a table. That was the target. Not reduced, not minimized, functionally erased. Iraqi radar operators weren't failing at their jobs that night. Their equipment was performing exactly as designed. It simply had nothing to perform against. The F-117 passed through their coverage like a rumor. No return, no track, no warning. The first indication that anything had entered Iraqi airspace was the sound of explosions at the AT&T telecommunications building in central Baghdad. 43 F-117s flew that entire war. They struck the highest value, most heavily defended targets in the country. Command bunkers, communications nodes, leadership compounds. The places where any other aircraft would have faced walls of fire. They flew at night, alone, without fighter escort, without electronic warfare support, without any of the massive suppression packages that every other coalition aircraft required just to survive. And across 6 weeks of relentless combat operations, not one was scratched. This isn't the kind of story that gets a Hollywood treatment. No dogfights, no dramatic ejections, no visible enemy. Just geometry, physics, and a 40-year engineering obsession that most people have never heard explained properly. That's exactly why this channel exists. If you want the real story behind how one country broke the rules of modern warfare, hit subscribe and drop a comment. A like is the only thing that keeps episodes like this one showing up in your feed. What made this possible wasn't just money or technology. It was a single mathematical insight discovered by accident, buried in a Soviet physicist's forgotten research paper. And the story of how it ended up in American hands is stranger than the aircraft it created. The paper smelled like mimeograph ink and old library paste. 36 pages of dense Soviet mathematics, typeset in Cyrillic, sitting in a stack of foreign technical journals at the Air Force Foreign Technology Division office in Dayton, Ohio. The year was 1971. Nobody had requested it. Nobody was looking for it. A translator picked it up because it was short. Pyotr Yakovlevich Ufimtsev, published Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction in 1962 through the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The work described how electromagnetic waves, radar included, scatter off two-dimensional and three-dimensional geometric shapes. Specifically, Ufimtsev developed equations that could predict the radar return of any given surface geometry with far greater precision than existing models. The math was elegant. The implications were enormous. Moscow's review board classified it as pure theory, interesting but operationally useless, and approved it for open publication. No export restrictions, no classification stamp. They just let it go. I think this might be the most consequential bureaucratic misjudgment of the 20th century. The translated paper circulated through the usual channels. Defense contractors received copies. Most filed them. At Lockheed's Skunk Works in Burbank, California, a 36-year-old mathematician named Dennis Overholzer did not file his copy. He read it twice, then a third time, then started scribbling in the margins. Ufimtsev's equations predicted how radar energy scattered off specific shapes. Overholzer realized you could run the math backward. Instead of analyzing how a given shape reflects radar, you could design a shape that reflects radar energy anywhere except back toward the receiver. You could engineer absence. He built a computer program called Echo 1. It modeled radar cross-sections for flat-panel geometric shapes, not curves, not smooth aerodynamic surfaces, but hard angles and facets. The results were absurd. Certain configurations returned virtually no radar energy to the source. The numbers suggested you could build a full-sized aircraft with a radar signature smaller than a bird, smaller than a bolt. Overholzer brought a small wooden model to Ben Rich's office. Rich had just taken over Skunk Works leadership from the legendary Kelly Johnson. He was an aerodynamicist, a practical engineer, a man who believed in thrust and lift coefficients. Overholzer set the model on his desk, an ugly, angular thing that looked like it had been folded out of sheet metal by someone who hated airplanes, and told Rich its computed radar cross-section matched a ball bearing. Rich stared at it. This thing can't even fly. Overholzer wasn't talking about flight, he was talking about visibility. The Pentagon wasn't interested either. Prevailing doctrine held that aircraft survived through speed and altitude, the SR-71 model. You outran the missile, you outclimbed the interceptor. The idea that you could simply vanish from the scope struck most flag officers as fantasy. Rival contractors called it a science project. Some of Lockheed's own engineers thought Overholzer had lost the thread. DARPA believed him. In 1977, the agency funded Have Blue, two subscale stealth demonstrators built in a secure hangar at the Skunk Works under classification levels that didn't officially exist. The airframes looked like geometry homework. Faceted panels, sharp edges, surfaces angled to bounce radar energy downward and sideways, anywhere but back to the transmitter. They flew out of Groom Lake. Both prototypes eventually crashed, one from a flight control failure, the other from engine trouble. The test pilots survived, but before those crashes, something happened at the radar tracking stations surrounding the test range. Operators watched their screens as the Have Blue demonstrators flew directly through active radar coverage at medium altitude, broad daylight, no jamming, no countermeasures. The screens showed nothing. Occasionally, a brief flicker, a return the size of a marble, there and gone. The trackers called in maintenance, assuming equipment failure. The equipment checked out fine. The foundational mathematics came from a Soviet physicist who published openly because his own government saw no practical application. The Americans read his paper, inverted his equations, and built a weapon that made Soviet air defense doctrine obsolete. Moscow handed them the keys. Washington built the lock. We have lost an entire generation of air defense investment. A senior Soviet military official reportedly said this to colleagues within weeks of Desert Storm's conclusion. The records don't specify which official. The sentiment didn't need attribution. Moscow watched Baghdad's billion-dollar Soviet-designed air defense network fail to detect a single F-117 sortie across 42 days of war. Every SA-6 battery, every early warning radar, Every command and control node they'd sold to Iraq performed exactly as engineered, and none of it mattered. The Kremlin's response came fast on paper, slow in metal. The MiG-144, their first stealth demonstrator, flew once. January 2000, one flight. Then it sat in a hangar and rusted. The Sukhoi S-37 Berkut had those gorgeous forward-swept wings, looked like science fiction, flew like a research project, reduced radar returns by approximately nothing. Funding collapsed alongside the Soviet Union itself. Engineers scattered. Entire design bureaus lost their senior staff to emigration or poverty. Stealth demands manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Soviet factories built rugged aircraft for muddy runways. Precision at that scale required an industrial culture they never developed. The Su-57 arrived 2 decades late. First flight 2010, limited service around 2020, roughly 10 operational airframes by the mid-20s. Western assessments are blunt. Engine inlets unshielded, panel joints visible on satellite imagery, radar cross-section orders of magnitude larger than an F-22. It's a reduced signature platform. That's a polite way of saying it's less visible than a flanker. So is a Cessna. China took a different approach. They stole what they could. The J-20, first flight 2011, borrows visual DNA from both the F-22 and F-35. Its canard configuration solves an aerodynamic problem while creating a stealth one. Canards generate radar returns that defeat the purpose of shaping the rest of the airframe. The J-31 looks like an F-35 from certain angles, which tells you something about its design origins. Neither aircraft runs on Chinese engines. Both rely on Russian AL-31 variants. Rear aspect stealth on the J-20 is widely assessed as poor. Europe never seriously tried. The Typhoon and Rafale carry reduced observability features the way a sedan carries a spoiler. Cosmetic, not structural. BAE's Taranis drone showed promise. Political reality killed it. Multinational programs distribute manufacturing across countries for jobs, not performance. Every competitor hit the same wall. Stealth isn't a technology. It's a system. Shaping, materials, engine masking, internal weapons bays, sensor fusion, maintenance infrastructure. Each element is independently brutal. Integration is exponentially harder. The Americans solved that integration problem across 4 decades of classified work. Sustained by black budget funding, no rival could match. While Moscow celebrated reducing a fighter's radar return to the size of a car, Lockheed had already reached the marble. The F-117 Nighthawk was never a good airplane. It needs to be said plainly. It was slow, subsonic, maxing out around 600 knots. It carried 2 laser-guided bombs, period. Its flight characteristics were so unstable that without constant computer correction, it would have tumbled out of the sky like a folded napkin. Pilots called it the Wobblin' Goblin. It looked like origami designed by a committee that had never seen a bird. None of that mattered. Because the only metric that counted, the one that rewrote the value of every fighter, bomber, and missile system on Earth, was whether radar could find it. Radar could not find it. 40% of Desert Storm's strategic targets were struck by an aircraft that represented 2.5% of the coalition fleet. That ratio is not an advantage. It is an indictment of everything else flying. The B-2 Spirit solved the Nighthawk's ugliest compromise. By 1997, computing power had advanced enough to model radar reflections off curved surfaces. No more faceted origami. Northrop Grumman's flying wing carried 40,000 pounds of ordnance across intercontinental range with a radar signature that remains classified to this day. The marble comparison stuck. What it actually achieved may have been smaller. 21 were built. Each cost $2.1 billion. The most expensive aircraft ever constructed, and sortie for sortie, the most destructive. Then the Raptor broke the pattern entirely. Every stealth aircraft before it had traded performance for invisibility. The F-117 couldn't dogfight. The B-2 couldn't evade an interceptor. The F-22 refused the trade. Super Cruise, sustained supersonic flight without afterburner. Super maneuverability. sensor fusion that processed the entire battlespace and handed the pilot a single integrated picture. For the first time in history, the stealthiest aircraft in the sky was simultaneously the deadliest fighter ever built. It has never been defeated in any engagement, simulated or real. 187 were produced. None were exported. Not to Britain, not to Japan, not to anyone. The F-35 Lightning II did something arguably more radical than any of them. It made stealth ordinary. 3 variants for 3 services. Over 1,000 airframes delivered to 18 nations by the mid-20s. Where the Raptor was a scalpel locked in a vault, the Lightning was a standard-issue rifle handed to every Allied infantry squad on Earth. Its deepest innovation wasn't the signature, it was the network. The F-35 processes and shares more tactical information in real time than any platform in history. Stealth became table stakes. The real product was omniscience. Stand back far enough and the arc is obvious. A subsonic, barely flyable bomb truck held together by computer corrections. A $2 billion flying wing that could cross oceans unseen. A superfighter that ended the compromise between stealth and performance. A networked sensor platform produced at industrial scale and distributed to allies across 4 continents. Each generation solved the last generation's fatal limitation. The F-117 sacrificed performance. The B-2 sacrificed cost. The F-22 sacrificed numbers. The F-35 sacrificed nothing fundamental and rolled off the line by the hundreds. The Americans didn't just invent stealth, they commoditized it. The farmland outside Bujanovci sits flat and featureless, winter wheat in every direction, the kind of landscape where you can watch a dog run away for 3 days. On the evening of March 27, 1999, Lieutenant Colonel Zoltan Dani was watching something else. His radar screen. Short bursts only. 3 seconds on, then dark. Move the battery. Wait. 3 seconds on. Dark again. Dani commanded a Serbian SA-3 Neva battery. The system was designed in 1961, vacuum tubes, Soviet manuals. NATO called it the Goa and considered it obsolete before most of his operators were born. Against the F-117 Nighthawk, the aircraft that had unmade Baghdad's air defenses 8 years earlier, the SA-3 shouldn't have mattered. It was a museum piece, shooting at a ghost. Dani had studied the ghost. For weeks, he'd tracked the patterns. The Americans were flying identical routes on identical schedules, ingressing from the same corridors at the same altitudes. Stealth made them invisible. Routine made them predictable. He couldn't see the aircraft. He could see the schedule. That night, his operators caught something. A faint return, barely distinguishable from noise. At close range, low altitude, moving along the expected corridor. The blip pulsed briefly, then vanished. It reappeared. The bomb bay doors had opened, and for a few seconds the Nighthawk's radar cross-section bloomed from a marble to something targetable. Dani's crew had seconds. He gave the order. 2 missiles launched. He wasn't certain what he was shooting at. 1 missile found Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko's aircraft. The Nighthawk broke apart over Serbian farmland. Zelko ejected into the dark, landed in a field, and was rescued by a combat search and rescue team hours later. He survived. The airframe did not. What happened next mattered more than the fireball. Serbian troops recovered the wreckage and paraded it for cameras. Pieces of radar-absorbent material, the classified skin that made the Nighthawk invisible, were cataloged, crated, and shipped to Moscow, to Beijing. Western intelligence assessed that both nations' stealth research programs accelerated measurably in the years following. The Chinese J-20 flew 12 years later. The wreckage of 1 American aircraft became a curriculum. But stand back from the propaganda footage and count. 1. Across the entire operational history of American stealth, Panama, Desert Storm, Southern Watch, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya, Syria, 1 aircraft lost to enemy fire. Thousands of sorties, 1 shootdown. It required a commander of unusual intelligence running obsolete equipment with modified tactics against an opponent flying predictable routes without electronic warfare support or fighter escort. It required the bomb bay doors to open at precisely the right moment within the detection cone of a radar that was on for 3 seconds. It required luck that Danny himself acknowledged. "I had a good opportunity," he said in interviews years later. He chose his words carefully. He respected the technology. He knew what he'd done was the exception, not the template. The Americans, he noted, adjusted their tactics immediately. He never got another shot. No one else got a first one. The Pentagon's lesson was not that stealth had failed. The lesson was that stealth alone, without unpredictable routing, without electronic attack, without suppression of enemy air defenses, left a seam. Every stealth platform designed after Kosovo closed that seam. The F-22 carried its own electronic warfare suite. The F-35 networked with every jammer and radar killer in the battle space. The B-21 was designed from the outset for contested environments where the enemy had studied the wreckage. Danny proved that an invisible aircraft could die. The Americans made sure it would only happen once. Pyotr Ufimtsev was grading undergraduate papers when the towers fell. He had moved to Los Angeles in 1993, taken a professorship at UCLA's Electrical Engineering Department, and settled into a quiet life teaching electromagnetics to students who had no idea they were sitting across from the man who made the F-117 possible. The Soviets hadn't fired him. They'd ignored him. The Americans gave him a faculty office with a window. I think about that office sometimes. The absurdity of it. The physicist, whose 36 pages of diffraction theory rendered Soviet air defenses worthless, teaching in California, drawing an American salary, while Moscow spent billions trying to reverse engineer the consequences of his own published work. Bureaucracy handed the United States its greatest military advantage of the 20th century, and the man responsible commuted to campus in a sedan. Somewhere in the high desert, the B-21 Raider is flying. Northrop Grumman rolled it out in 22. First flight, 23. Details stay classified, but the trajectory is clear. The marble is no longer the goal. The goal is to push radar cross-section below the noise floor, to make the return indistinguishable from weather, from birds, from the random electromagnetic clutter that every radar operator filters out without thinking. 100 bombers planned. Unit cost reportedly around $700 million. The sixth-generation fighter program behind it carries a classification level that makes the B-2 program look transparent. Every competitor is still chasing. China's J-20 received engine upgrades, indigenous WS-15 turbofans, if Beijing's claims hold. The Su-57 got a production order for 76 airframes that Russian industry has struggled to fill. Europe announced the Global Combat Air Program, Tempest, FCAS, glossy renders, multinational work-share agreements, delivery dates in the 2040s. The gap hasn't closed. Look at the numbers. The Americans operate more fifth-generation stealth fighters than every other nation on Earth combined. That margin isn't shrinking. No aircraft truly vanishes. Stealth is reduction, not elimination. Physics doesn't permit perfection. But when your radar return measures in fractions of a square meter and your adversary's best fighter reflects energy like a dinner table, the distinction between nearly invisible and invisible is academic. Colonel al-Rashid's scope stayed clean while his capital burned. To him, the jets had vanished entirely. The Soviets spent the last decade of their existence building the S-300, a surface-to-air system designed specifically to detect and kill low-observable aircraft. They refined it into the S-400. They sold it to China, Turkey, India. They oriented their entire air defense doctrine around countering American stealth. And the math that made stealth possible came from their own institute, written by their own physicist, published in their own journal because a committee decided it had no military application. Ufimtsev retired from UCLA in 2011. He filed his last grade reports, locked his office, and drove home through Los Angeles traffic. He was 80 years old. His paper had been in print for half a century. Somewhere over the Pacific, an F-22 was pulling contrails at 50,000 feet, running silent, radar dark, carrying his equations in every surface.